I remember the smell of my mother's closet better than I remember most things from childhood. It wasn't perfume exactly, or at least not any single perfume, but rather the accumulated softness of years. Fabric softener and cedar, something floral and faint, the particular warmth that clothes hold when they have been worn and washed and folded by the same hands for a long time. I was perhaps 5 or 6 the first time I slipped inside that closet while she was in the kitchen making lunch. I don't know what drew me in. Curiosity, maybe. Or something older and quieter than curiosity, something that didn't have a name yet, something that lived in me before I had words for it. I stood in the half-dark with the door cracked open, and I touched things. A silk blouse in a pale coral color. A cardigan with small pearlescent buttons. A dress she wore to weddings, navy blue with a sash at the waist. I didn't try anything on that day. I was too small, and besides, there was something that already told me not to, some early social programming that I'd absorbed before I could consciously recall absorbing it. But I touched everything, and I felt something in my chest that I couldn't explain then and can barely explain now. A kind of recognition settling, as though some restless part of me had briefly found a place to be still. My name is Daniel. I was born the second of 3 children, the only boy, sandwiched between my older sister Priya and my younger sister Meena. My father was an engineer, methodical and quiet, a man who showed love through provision and practical gesture rather than words. My mother was a schoolteacher, warm and perceptive, but tired in the way that women who carry entire households inside them always seem to be tired. We lived in a mid-sized city in an ordinary neighborhood with a front porch and a back garden and a life that looked, from any outside angle, entirely unremarkable. Growing up between 2 sisters shaped me in ways I am still discovering. I was immersed from the earliest age in a world of female things, not because anyone forced me, but because that was simply where the life of the household happened. My mother and sisters talked over the dinner table about things I was expected to ignore. Hairstyles, a classmate's cruelty, the way a certain teacher made Priya feel embarrassed in front of the class. My father would disappear behind his newspaper or his television program, and I was meant to disappear with him into that masculine silence. But I never quite could. I sat at the table longer than I was supposed to. I listened. I found their conversations more interesting, more real somehow, than anything that was supposed to belong to me. I played with my sisters more than I played with boys from school, and this too felt natural for a while, felt like just who I was. We would make up elaborate games that involved characters and stories and feelings, the kind of imaginative play that required you to try on being someone other than yourself. And it was in those games, in the safety of childhood pretend, that I first slipped into something like what I actually was. Priya would cast me in roles sometimes. When her friend wasn't there to play the other part, I would be the neighbor lady, or the aunt come to visit, or a princess from a story we'd invented. I would adopt a voice, a walk, a way of holding my hands, and something in my body would go quiet and right in a way that, as soon as the game ended and I returned to being Daniel, would leave behind a faint echo of longing that I didn't understand. I want to be careful here because memory is a complicated thing. I don't want to look back and construct a narrative that makes everything feel inevitable, as though I always knew what I was and was simply waiting. That is not how it was. What I remember is confusion. What I remember is a feeling that was pleasant in the moment and troubling afterward, like touching something warm and then being afraid of what warmth means. I was a child. I had no framework. I had only sensation and the slow, private accumulation of moments that didn't fit together into any story I'd ever been given. My father wanted, in the indirect way that fathers want things, for me to be interested in what he was interested in. Sports, cars, tools, the practical geography of maleness. He didn't push hard because he was not a pushy man, but his mild disappointment was something I could sense the way you sense weather changing, not through any single signal but through a shift in the quality of the air. I tried. I really did try. I joined the neighborhood cricket team for 1 season and spent most of it fielding at third man and thinking about other things. I went with him to watch football and sat close and tried to feel what he felt, that clean surge of tribal excitement, and felt instead just the cold of the bleachers and a mild interest in the colors of the jerseys. What I felt most naturally, most easily, was something that I came to think of as an attention to surface, to how things looked and felt, and what they communicated. I noticed what people wore. I noticed how fabrics moved. I noticed Priya's earrings when she came home from school, the small gold hoops she'd saved for 3 months to buy, and something in me ached with a feeling I filed immediately under something else, something safer. Appreciation, I told myself. You just have good taste. You're sensitive. That's all it is. There was an afternoon when I was around 11. I remember it clearly because it was the week after Priya's birthday, when I found a bag of her old clothes in the hallway, things she'd grown out of that my mother was sorting for donation. I was alone in the house, which was rare. My father was at work. My mother had taken Mina to a dentist appointment. Priya was at a friend's house. The bag was open at the top, and lying right there, visible, was a soft pink sweater, the kind with a wide neck that slips off one shoulder. Priya had worn it often. I'd always noticed it on her. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time. The house was completely silent, except for the refrigerator hum. And then I did something I had never consciously decided to do. I picked up the sweater, carried it to the bathroom, locked the door, and tried it on. It was too small across the shoulders. It didn't fit the way I'd imagined. And yet when I looked at myself in the mirror, something happened in my face that I'd never seen happen before. I looked, just for a moment, like someone I recognized. Not like Priya. Not like anyone else. Like someone that I had never been allowed to be and had perhaps never admitted I wanted to be. My eyes went very still. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, and then I took it off, folded it exactly as I had found it, put it back in the bag, and went to my room and sat on my bed and tried to understand what had just happened to me. I didn't try anything on again for years. What that afternoon left behind was not curiosity. It had burned through curiosity into something more complicated, a feeling that felt almost like shame but wasn't quite shame, because shame requires you to believe you've done something wrong, and I wasn't sure yet whether I had. It was more like exposure. As though I had accidentally looked at something true about myself in a badly lit room, and the glimpse had frightened me more than the darkness had. I went through secondary school with a version of myself that was assembled very deliberately. I learned to perform boyishness without ever quite feeling it. I made friends with other boys, I went to parties, I talked about girls in the way boys are supposed to talk about girls. I was not miserable. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes assume that anyone living this kind of internal doubling must be suffering every moment, and that was not my experience. I had real friendships. I had genuine pleasures. I was a good student, particularly in English and history, and I took real satisfaction in being good at those things. My life, as I moved through it, had texture and meaning. But there was always this other thing, running alongside everything else, like a second river beneath the surface of the ground. I found myself, in those years, drawn to women's spaces and women's conversations not out of any desire to intrude, but out of a genuine sense that I belonged there more than I belonged in the spaces I was assigned. My closest friendships were with girls. I understood their humor, their emotional shorthand, the way they communicated through gesture and tone rather than statement. I felt known in those friendships in a way I rarely felt with male friends, where there always seemed to be a register of experience I couldn't quite access. I got married at 28. Her name was Aisha, and I loved her. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I loved her, and I love her still, and nothing about what happened between us or inside me changes the reality of that love, though it changed the shape of our life together in ways neither of us had expected. Aisha was a lawyer, precise and funny, and full of a kind of vigorous empathy. She cared about people with a directness that I admired and sometimes envied. She understood me, or understood the version of me that I had always presented, which is not quite the same thing, but is also not nothing. Our early years of marriage were good. We built a life that felt solid. We moved into a flat with large windows and afternoon light. We argued about small things and resolved them. We talked about everything except the thing I could not find words for, which had in those years retreated so far into the background of my daily consciousness that I had almost convinced myself it was not really there at all. I was a husband. I was someone's husband. I filled that role with genuine effort and real love, And I told myself that the other thing, whatever the other thing was just a childhood strangeness that had burned itself out. And then we moved into the house. It was a bigger place, our first house actually owned rather than rented, with a spare room that Aisha converted into a proper study and a bedroom with a walk-in wardrobe. And it was in that wardrobe, with its long hanging rail and full-length mirror, that something I had successfully buried for 15 years began, very quietly, to resurface. It started with Aisha's clothes. Not in any transgressive way, or at least not in a way that felt transgressive at the time. She traveled for work sometimes 3 or 4 days at a stretch, and during those trips I would find myself in the wardrobe looking for something. A belt she'd borrowed, a phone charger that had gotten tucked behind a box, and I would find myself slowing down, looking, touching the fabric of a blouse the way I used to touch my mother's things. Feeling that old settling. One evening, a Thursday in November, Aisha away in Edinburgh for a conference, I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time. It was raining outside. The house was very quiet. And I did something that I had not done since I was 11 years old in a bathroom with a locked door. I went to her wardrobe and I chose a blouse, a simple ivory silk blouse with small buttons and a dark cardigan, and I sat on the bed holding them in my lap and I thought, very calmly, about who I was. I didn't put them on that night. I held them. That was all. And then I hung them carefully back exactly where they'd been, and I went downstairs and made tea, and sat with the television on, and felt something that took me days to identify. It wasn't shame. It was grief. Not grief for anything lost, not exactly, but grief for something that had been waiting a very long time and was tired of waiting. Over the following months, slowly and with enormous private deliberation, I began to allow myself to do what I had been not doing my entire adult life. I bought, for the first time, things of my own. I was terrified the first time I walked into a shop. I am describing this now from a distance of several years, and even at this distance I can feel the particular fear of that moment, choosing a shop I'd never been in before in a part of the city where I didn't know anyone, telling myself I was buying a gift. I picked up a soft gray scarf, a beautiful thing, merino wool with a slight shimmer to it. The woman at the till didn't look at me strangely. Why would she? She rang it up and said it was a lovely choice and asked if I'd like it gift wrapped, and I said yes. And then at home I unwrapped it myself and put it around my neck and stood in the bathroom and felt something that I can only describe as coming home through a door you've been afraid of for 30 years. I bought more things. Slowly, carefully, always with the excuse ready in my mind that they were for someone else, always aware that I was lying to myself with a lie that was getting harder to maintain. A cardigan. A pair of soft trousers with a feminine cut that I told myself were just comfortable. A simple skirt that I kept in a box at the back of a shelf and took out only when I was alone. I was not performing anything for anyone. I was not trying to look a particular way or achieve a particular effect. I was simply, for the first time, allowing myself to exist in a way that felt consonant with something deep and inarticulate inside me, and the relief of it was so profound that it frightened me. The fear ran alongside the relief the entire time. I want you to understand that. These were not separate phases, first fear, then relief. They were simultaneous and continuous. Every time I allowed myself this private latitude, I also felt the ground shift under everything I thought I knew about myself, about my marriage, about the life I had built. I am a rational person. I believe in taking things apart and understanding them. But there is no rational process for discovering, in your mid-30s, that the self you have inhabited your entire adult life is only part of the story. I began to research. Quietly, carefully, always in private browser sessions that I cleared afterward, with the paranoid care of someone doing something they haven't yet decided they're allowed to do. I read forums and first-person accounts, memoirs and articles, and what I found there was not a simple or unified story. I found a spectrum of experience so wide and various that it almost didn't help, except for one thing, the relief of recognition. The specific, flooding relief of reading something written by another person and thinking, for the first time in your life, that is how it feels. That is exactly how it has always felt, and I have never had those words. I read about crossdressing as distinct from gender dysphoria. I read about non-binary identity. I read about people who had known since childhood and people who had not known until middle age, people who had told their partners and people who had not, people whose marriages had survived and people whose marriages had not. I did not, at that point, arrive at any conclusion about where exactly I fell in this vast landscape of human experience. I only knew that I was in it, that I was not an anomaly or an aberration, but a person navigating a particular and well-documented kind of interior complexity. That knowledge alone, the simple not being alone of it, changed something in me that I hadn't even known was constricted. Aisha noticed something.
Of course she did.
She was perceptive in a way that her profession had sharpened, but that was also simply innate to her. She didn't say anything for a long time. She has told me since that she noticed a shift in my quality of presence, some new thoughtfulness or preoccupation that she couldn't name, and that she was giving me space to come to her in my own time. She knew me well enough to know that you cannot rush me. That when I am processing something, it takes the form of a long interior conversation that resolves eventually into words, but only when it is ready, and not a moment before. There was a Sunday morning in March. I remember it so specifically. The quality of the light through the kitchen window, the particular pale blue of the sky, coffee and mugs on the table between us. We had slept late, which we rarely did, and we were in that gentle, unguarded place that late weekend mornings sometimes create. Aisha was reading something on her tablet, and I was looking out the window, and I heard myself say, into the silence, completely without planning, "I've been trying to tell you something for a long time." She put the tablet down. She looked at me without alarm, or rather with the kind of stillness that she adopts when she is fully present, which is its own kind of alarm because it means she knows something real is coming. "I know," she said. "Just that. I know." What followed was not a single conversation but a series of conversations spread over weeks, careful and often painful, and also full of moments of extraordinary tenderness. I told her about the bathroom when I was 11. I told her about the bag of clothes in the hallway. I told her about the things I'd bought, the gray scarf, the cardigan, the skirt in its box on the shelf. I told her about the feeling of relief and the feeling of fear and the long years of not having words for any of it. I told her I didn't know exactly what it meant about who I was. I told her I was sorry for not telling her sooner. I told her I was still the person she had married, and I also told her that I understood that this complicated things, and that whatever she felt about it was legitimate, and I was not asking her to suppress it.
She cried.
Not in the way I had feared, not with horror or revulsion, but in a quieter way, with a complexity I could see on her face that I interpreted, then and now, as grief mixed with love, and the particular sadness of realizing that someone you thought you knew completely has been carrying something you couldn't see. She reached across the table and took my hand and held it. And then she said very carefully that she needed time to think and that she loved me, and that those two things were going to have to coexist for a while. They did coexist. For several months, they coexisted. There were conversations that went well and conversations that didn't. There were evenings when she needed space and evenings when we sat together on the sofa and simply held on to each other. There were questions she asked that I answered as honestly as I could, and questions I couldn't answer because I didn't have the answers yet, questions like, where does this lead? What does this mean for our future? Who are you becoming? I couldn't tell her who I was becoming. I was in the middle of it. What I could tell her, and did, in as many different ways as the weeks allowed, was this. I had never been dishonest with her about love. I had never been dishonest about commitment or desire for our shared life. What I had been was incomplete, not through any calculated deception, but through the kind of slow-motion self-concealment that takes on its own momentum, that becomes its own kind of truth until something cracks it open. The cracking open was difficult. I would not pretend otherwise. There were nights I lay awake in the particular silence of a room where the other person is not sleeping either, where you can feel each other's wakefulness like a temperature in the air, and I felt the possibility of losing everything I had built. I felt the ground of my life as genuinely uncertain in a way it had never been, and I understood that the uncertainty was of my own making. And I sat with that without flinching because there was no alternative. My sister Priya found out before my parents. This was accidental or semi-accidental, the specific way that the things were not ready for tend to surface anyway, as though they have their own timeline that doesn't consult our readiness. She had come to stay for a long weekend while Aisha was at a conference, and she found, not the skirt in the box, but the scarf. She found it because she was cold and I'd said help yourself to anything in the wardrobe, and she'd found the scarf among my things and held it up with a question in her face because she'd recognized it as something she might wear, something that didn't read as mine. I sat with her on the sofa, and I told her a shorter version of what I had told Aisha. I watched her face while I talked, and I saw something pass through it that I identified, afterward, as recognition. Not of something she'd suspected, but of something that, once named, clarified other things. A lifetime of small moments that now arranged themselves differently. She said, after a pause that felt very long, "Does it change anything about who you are to me?" I said I didn't know, that the question was partly what I was working out. She said, "You're my brother. You've always been a little more like this than you probably wanted to show. I think I've always known something was there." It is a strange thing to be seen, particularly when you have spent most of your life not being seen, or being seen only partially, only in the aspects of yourself that you had learned to make visible. When Priya said that, something shifted in my chest, not dramatically, not with any great outward sign, but in the way that a long-held tension quietly releases, imperceptibly, over time. She did not have all the answers any more than I did. She did not know what any of this would eventually look like. But she sat with me in the not knowing, and that was more than I had expected from anyone. Telling my parents was a different thing entirely. My father and I had an understanding, which was the closest thing to closeness available to us, a mutual respect, a shared humor that lived in understatement, an affection that expressed itself through practical gesture and quiet consistency. He was not an unkind man. He was simply a man of his time and formation, with ideas about what a son is that had never been questioned by anything in his experience. I did not know what this information would do to those ideas. I was afraid it would do more damage than could be repaired. My mother was different. She had always been perceptive in a way that I associated with having taught children for 30 years. She had a particular ability to see people without flinching, to understand that human beings are complicated without finding that complication threatening. And there was something else. There were the afternoons when I was 5 or 6 in the warm dark of her closet, touching the fabric of her things. There were the games with Priya and Meena, where I played characters that felt more true than my actual character. My mother had been present for all of those things. I suspected she had never entirely filed them away. The conversation with my parents took place over a dinner at their house, an ordinary dinner, the kind we'd had hundreds of times. I waited until we were past the food and into the slow, comfortable settling of the end of a meal, when everyone is full and a little softened. My mother was washing up. My father was at the table with tea. I asked her to come and sit, which she did with a look that told me she had been waiting for this conversation in some form for some time. I told them. I was 37 years old, and I sat at the table where I had eaten as a child, and I told my parents who I was, as fully and calmly as I could.
My father was quiet for a long time.
I watched his face. He is not a man who shows his interior easily, and what I saw there was not legible to me in the moment. I saw him taking something in, filing it somewhere, trying to find a place for it in an architecture of self that had not been built with this in mind. He asked me one question. He said, "Are you happy?" I told him I was working toward it. He nodded. That was all. He picked up his tea, and he nodded. My mother reached across and took my hand, and I felt her grip tight and dry and firm, the grip of a woman who has known more about you than you knew she knew, and she said, "I wondered, sometimes, when you were small."
She paused.
I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't. I told her there was nothing to be sorry for, that I hadn't known how to say it, and she couldn't have said what I hadn't said. She shook her head slightly, the way she does when she disagrees but doesn't want to argue. She held my hand for a long time. My father asked, eventually, awkward but trying, what this meant in practical terms. Whether I was going to change. What my life was going to look like. I told him, honestly, that I was still working that out, that it was not a single decision but a series of small ones, that the most important thing was that I was no longer pretending. He didn't fully understand this, I could see that. But he nodded again and he didn't withdraw, and that was more than I had allowed myself to hope for. There is something I have thought about often in the years since: the difference between being accepted and being understood. They are not the same thing, and in those first conversations with the people I loved, I received acceptance more readily than understanding, which is perhaps the natural order. Understanding takes longer. It requires the other person to do their own interior work, to revise their own memories and expectations and maps of who you are. My parents did that work, slowly and in their own way, over the following months and years. My father asked questions sometimes, careful questions that told me he was thinking about it. My mother read things, I don't know what, and occasionally mentioned something she'd read, indirectly, without making it into a production. Aisha and I went to a therapist. We went separately first and then together, and the therapy did not save us from difficulty but gave us a language for it, a framework within which to understand what we were each experiencing. I learned, in those sessions, to articulate things I had previously only felt, the way that concealment over a long period of time becomes indistinguishable from identity, how a person can lose track of where the performance ends and the self begins, and how the work of recovery is not dramatic revelation, but patient archaeology. Aisha learned, or began to learn, that this was not about her, not a judgment on her, not a failure of the marriage, not a secret that had been kept out of cruelty. That understanding came slowly and not without pain, and I will not simplify it. What we arrived at, over time, was a new version of our life together. Not a repaired version of the old one. Repair implies the old thing was right, and just broke. This was something new, built with knowledge we hadn't had when we started. It required honesty about what I needed and honesty about what Aisha needed, and a great deal of patient negotiation about how those needs could coexist. I will not say it was easy. I will say it was worth doing. I began, in those years, to present more authentically in small, and then less small ways. The scarf. A cardigan I wore to the shops. Clothes that were technically ungendered, but that I chose from a different place than I used to choose, with an eye toward how they felt rather than what they communicated about which category I belonged to. I sat with a stylist for the first time in my life, a woman who came recommended by someone in a support group I joined and who did not treat me as a novelty or a problem but as a person who wanted to look like themselves, which is all anyone who goes to a stylist really wants. She asked me what I liked and listened to the answer, and we spent 2 hours talking about fabric and color and cut and how each of those things land differently on different bodies, and I left feeling more like myself than I could ever remember feeling in a mirror. People noticed. Of course people noticed. Some didn't say anything, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Some said things I hadn't expected. A colleague told me I seemed lighter. A friend from university whom I hadn't seen in several years said, and this was the most precise version of it, that I seemed to have arrived somewhere. I didn't explain what I'd arrived at. I said thank you, and I meant it. The question of category, of where exactly I fit in the vast and honestly rather bureaucratic taxonomy of gender identity, has been less central to my experience than you might expect. I know that for some people the naming is essential. The word is the key that unlocks everything else. For me it has been more gradual, more organic. I know that I experience myself as occupying a place in gender that doesn't map cleanly onto the options I was given at birth. I know that the clothes I wear and the way I present myself carry meaning that is not just aesthetic but deeply psychological, a form of self-expression that for me is also a form of self-recognition. I know that when I look in the mirror now, most days, I see someone I recognize. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. Mina, my younger sister, was the last to know among the immediate family because she was living abroad when all of this was unfolding, and our relationship had always been slightly more distant than my relationship with Priya. She found out through a conversation with Priya, which I had given Priya permission to have, and she called me the same evening. She was surprised, she told me, but not shocked, which struck me as a subtle and important distinction. She said she'd always thought of me as someone with a more fluid way of being in the world than most men she knew. She said this like it was an ordinary observation, like she was noting that I was good at cooking or bad at driving. I found this enormously comforting. The ordinariness of it. The way she was not treating it as an event, but simply as information. I have thought, many times, about what would have been different if I had known earlier. If there had been language available to me as a child, or representation in the culture I grew up in, or simply a single adult in my life who might have seen the boy who lingered in his mother's closet and found words that weren't shame. I have thought about this without great bitterness, because bitterness is not a useful companion for the road behind you. But I think about it with something. Sadness, maybe. The awareness that a great deal of energy went into the maintenance of a concealment that served no one. Not me, not the people who loved me, not the marriages and friendships that were built on a foundation with something load-bearing hidden inside the walls. I am 41 now. In some ways I feel younger than I have in years, which sounds like a paradox but feels like a description of a specific experience. The experience of no longer spending a significant portion of every day on the maintenance of a private and effortful silence. That energy goes somewhere else now. Into work. Into the marriage which has found its new form and which holds us with a different, and in some ways stronger kind of coherence. Into friendships that are more honestly maintained because I am more honestly present. Into the quiet, private pleasure of getting dressed in the morning in a way that feels like choosing rather than conforming. My mother came to visit last spring. We sat in the garden in the afternoon with tea, the way we do, and she asked me how I was really, the way she asks when she means something by it. I told her I was well. I told her I was genuinely well, and that I was still figuring things out, but that the figuring felt less frightening now and more like simply living. She nodded and was quiet for a while, and then she said something that I have turned over many times since, that I will probably carry for the rest of my life. She said, "I always thought there was more of you than you were showing. I'm glad the rest of you is here now." I didn't answer. I looked at the garden for a moment. The late afternoon light through the leaves, the particular quality of an ordinary spring day that somehow holds more than it seems to, and I felt something settle in me that has been in the process of settling for 40 years. Not the conclusion of anything. There are no conclusions in the stories I am trying to tell you about. But a resting place. A moment in which the person I am and the life I am living inside feel, for once, like the same thing. That is what I want to leave you with. If you have followed me this far through the long winding corridor of memory and confusion and quiet revelation. Not a transformation in the dramatic sense, not a sudden emergence or a single moment of clarity. Just the slow and ordinary miracle of a person finding their way to themselves by small steps across a long and sometimes frightening distance. The closet with the coral silk blouse. The bag in the hallway. The bathroom mirror at 11. The gray scarf. The Sunday morning with coffee. My mother's hand across the table. My father's single question, and the nod that followed. Aisha's voice saying I know before I had finished preparing to tell her. Priya on the sofa. The stylist who listened. The colleague who said I seemed lighter. All of it part of the same long conversation that a person has with themselves. In the end, a conversation that in my case began before I had words and continued through all the years of silence and eventually, finally, found its way into speech. I am still learning what I am. I expect I will be learning for a long time. But I am no longer learning alone, and I am no longer learning in the dark. And the difference between those two things, between the closet with the cracked door and the garden in spring with my mother's hand warm around her cup, is the distance I have traveled, and it is a long way, and I am glad, at last, to have arrived.